Welcome to Mining the Media, providing nuggets of news and cutting-edge questions and answers, minus the political blather. Here are your hosts, G.K. Allen and Dave Jeffers.
Welcome back to this special Independence Day weekend episode of Mining the Media. I'm Dave Jeffers, producer, co-host. That's G.K. Allen, our creator and the co-host. And we are excited, thrilled to bring back our friend William Federer of AmericanMinute.com. And he's going to talk to us today about primarily, and Bill, I think I'm going to set you up to kind of give us a preamble, we'll call it, in honor of what we're celebrating, of the importance of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, of course, but also what does it mean to us in 246 years later? So we're just going to hand it off to you, friend, and let you kind of give us an opening statement, if you will.
Sure. Well, one of the books I wrote is called Who is the King in America? It's an overview of 6,000 years of recorded human history, and it highlights how the most common form of government is a king. Nimrod, Pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan, Tsar. And as the centuries go on, the kingdoms get bigger because with military advancements, the king can kill more people. So instead of Cain killing Abel with a rock, they can kill with a bronze weapon or an iron weapon or a phalanx spear, those big long spears the Greeks had, or a composite bow that the Parthians or the Mongols had, or a scimitar sword that the Muslims had, or a stirrup, or a gunpowder that the Chinese invented. The weapon improves, but it's that same fallen nature of Cain killing Abel. And these kingdoms get bigger, right? With Assyria and Babylon and Persia and Alexander the Great, and Julius Caesar, and then you have the Muslims, and then the Vikings, and then Genghis Khan, and the maritime empires of Spain, France, but ultimately England. So the King of England was a globalist. He was a one world government guy with him at the top, and the sun never set on the British Empire. He had Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, British Guyana, Barbados, Bermuda, Jamaica, Canada, and America. And America's founders decided they didn't like this globalist king telling us what to do. And so they flipped it and made the people the king. So it's a polarity change in the flow of power. Instead of top down, it's bottom up. It's we the people. And in my book, I go through where the founders got these ideas of a bottom-up form of government. A little ancient Greece, ancient Rome, but ultimately ancient Israel. And so the New England pastors that founded Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and the Delaware and all these different colonies, they looked back to the Bible, but what part of the Bible? The first 400-year period when Israel came out of Egypt, before they got King Saul. And so it's called the Hebrew Republic, and it was studied by the Christian Hebraists. That was the name of the scholars between the Reformation, 1517, and the Age of Enlightenment in the early 1600s. You had a century where the scholars are not just thrilled that they can read the Bible in their own language. They focus on this period of time, the Hebrew Republic, and how it was so unusual that you could have a nation with millions of people and no king. And it worked because every single citizen was taught the law, and they were personally accountable to God to follow the law. And so that's what America's founders looked to. And it was called the Assembly of the Israelites. And it was the first instance in world history of private land ownership. Wherever there's a king, you never really own the land. It's always going to be conditional of you staying on the nice side of the king. In Israel, not only was there no king, the land was permanently titled to each family. And if you own land, you can accumulate stuff. The Bible called that being blessed. Karl Marx called it being a capitalist. Karl Marx says communism can be summed up in one sentence: abolition of private property. And so if you don't have any private property, how can you be charitable? What are you going to do? Steal from somebody and give it away? Now you're a thief? Right? No, so God entrusts you with private property so that you can manifest in the physical realm spiritually what's in your heart. Ancient Israel was the first nation with no police. Everyone was taught the law. Everyone helped enforce the law. It's like everybody was deputized. Ancient Israel had no prisons. So in Egypt, Joseph was in prison for several years. In Israel, when a crime was committed, you got the accused and the elders, and you went to the gates of the city and you had the trial right then. Israel had a bureaucracy-free welfare system. So in Egypt, people were selling their souls to the Pharaoh for a bag of grain. In Israel, when someone harvested their field, they left the gleanings, the corners, for the poor people to pick through, like Ruth. This way, the poor were taken care of without some political leader collecting everything and doling it back out to those who can help them stay in power. Israel was the first nation that could read. I thought this was fascinating. So in Egypt, they had 3,000 hieroglyphs. Only 1% of Egypt could read. Reading and writing was the scribes' secret knowledge, and they kept the hieroglyphs complicated on purpose as job security. Sumeria had 1,500 cuneiform characters, but it was just for court records, for kings to keep track of everything they owned. China had 10,000 characters just for court records. When Moses came down the mountain, he did not just have the law. He had the law in a 22-character alphabet. First letter's Aleph, second letter Beth, so easy to learn. Kids could learn it. And not only could they were required to. So Israel was the first instance of a literate populace, a nation with millions of people, and they could read. And so this dynamic is also, Israel is the first nation where there was no standing army. You have a king, he has an army to enforce his will. In Israel, every man was in the militia and armed with a sword upon their thigh, and they were ready at a moment's notice to defend their family and their community. One of the founders, I think is Joel Barlow, he said, a people that is in the habit of legislating for themselves should be in the habit of defending themselves. And so you have this scenario in ancient Israel where everyone was taught the law. I explain how if you take governmental power and have a line, and one side of the line is total government, the other side is no government. Total government power concentrates like a black hole into the hands of one person who rules through fear. The other side is no government, which would be anarchy, unless each citizen was taught the law. And they were taught everything I just explained. But the big question is, why would you follow it? What would motivate you to follow an internal moral? Ancient Israel had the key ingredient. There's a God who's watching everyone. He wants you to be fair, and he's going to hold you accountable in the future. So you're about to steal something, nobody's around, you know you can get away with it, and then you think, God is watching me. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. So it creates something in your head called a conscience. If everybody in the country believes this, you can maintain complete order with no police. And so this was the model, this Hebrew Republic, that was studied by the Pilgrims and the Puritans. I mean, they taught Hebrew at Harvard. One year, they even gave the valedictorian address in the Hebrew language. And when Yale was formed, to this day, Yale has Hebrew characters on its coat of arms. They say truth and light, but it's in Hebrew. And so they were fascinated with this Hebrew Republic. And one instance that I think is so amazing that shows this connection is the ratification of the Constitution. So the Constitution was written, but it needed to be ratified by 9 states. They had 8, and New Hampshire was in line to be the 9th, but it was having a deadlock. And so they got Harvard President Samuel Langdon to give him an address in 1788. And the address is titled, "The Republic of the Israelites, an Example to the American States."
Wow.
He says, instead of the 12 tribes of Israel, we may substitute the 13 states of the American Union and see this application plainly.
I have never heard that before.
Me neither.
And after his address, they voted, they ratified it. They were the 9th state to ratify it, and our U.S. Constitution went into effect.
Wow.
Our U.S. Constitution went into effect right after the sermon, "The Republic of the Israelites, an Example to the American States." And So this was looked to, referred to over and over again. They identified, even the pilgrims would say, that the Jews, the Israelites left the Pharaoh and we left the King of England. They crossed the Red Sea, we crossed the ocean. They came into their promised land. This is our promised land. They would make all kinds of references identifying with ancient Israel. And,
in other words, the Judeo-Christian ethic means something.
yes. And so this was the beginning of a bottom-up form of government. Because in Israel, they appointed their leaders. So Moses spake unto the children of Israel and said, how can I alone bear your burden? Take you, wise men, and understanding, and known among your tribes, and I'll make them rulers over you. So this was an election process within each tribe. So the people that hate covetousness, they're honest, and so each town and village had a meeting place. The Hebrew word for meeting place is synagogue.
Yeah.
And so in the synagogue, they would be taught the law, but they would also choose their elders. And so America's founders in New England copied this. They taught the law and the word of God in the church, but then they would have their government town hall meetings in the church building. I mean, why build a whole separate building just to talk about something else? Right? I mean, they'd often meet in the choir loft and they'd have the government meeting. And they basically took their church model of government and made it their community model of government. And so for most of the Middle Ages, it was a hierarchical church model where you had cardinals and archbishops and bishops and vicars and deaneries and curates and priests. And it was all, well, when the Reformation happened, you had these Protestants looking back to the assembly of the Israelites, and they saw that when Jesus says, upon this rock I'll build my church, that word that Jesus said church is in the Greek is ecclesia,
right,
or ecclesia. Ek means out of, ecclesia means a calling. And it was 6,000 citizens in the Greek city of Athens, and they would call them out of their homes into the market, and they were deciding what was going to happen in the town. They divvy up responsibilities and so forth. So Jesus says, upon this rock, I'll build my ecclesia, my body, and everybody has a part. And he that's faithful in the very little gets entrusted with some more. And right. And so this model was adopted by the Puritans and the Baptists and the Congregationalists, and they settled colonies. And so the first colony is Virginia, but it was Anglican. Second colony was Massachusetts. All right. And the Puritans came over. That was great. But then the Puritans were strict, and they said only Puritans could vote. And so you had Thomas Hooker, a pastor. He said, no, anybody that's a Christian should be allowed to vote. And so he and his church flee, and they found Providence, Rhode Island, and Hartford, Connecticut. And their church members come to him and say, can you do a sermon on how we're supposed to set up our government? And so he does in 1638. And it's titled, The Foundation of Authority is Laid in the Free Consent of the People.
Wow.
And that phrase was reflected in our Declaration, government from the consent of the governed. And then you had another pastor named Roger Williams. He and his church fled, and they founded Providence, Rhode Island, and the first Baptist church in America. And they basically took their congregational church government and they made it their community government. And they called them town hall meetings. And when the revolution started, the British sent over a military governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Gage, and he was bothered by these town hall meetings making resolutions. And so he banned them. He says, we don't need the people to meet and have, you just do what the king tells you to do.
In other words, cancel culture.
Yeah. And shut the people up. And we don't want them having access to social media and sharing their views. We want to censor it all. We only want them to say what the government approved rhetoric storyline, right? And
so Solomon was right. There's nothing new under the sun.
Yeah. But America, big picture is the word citizen. So the word politics is Greek. It comes from the word polis, which means city. Mm-hmm. Metropolis, Indianapolis, Annapolis, right? And so politics is simply the business of the city. And in the city of Hartford, all there was the church members. In the city of Providence, Rhode Island, all there was the church members. So they were involved. And so the word citizen is Greek. It means co-king. right? So kings over in Europe, kings have subjects who are subjected to the king's will. Democracies and republics have citizens. The word citizen means co-king. So our founders basically said, you get to be the king of your life, and you get to decide what career you want to pursue, who you want to marry, what clothes you want to wear. You don't have to wear burqas if you don't want to, what food you want to eat. You can eat pork if you want to, right? You may get to be in charge of your life, and then all of us together are in charge of the country.
Wow.
And
Bill, as you say all that, and you said something, I had to write myself a note, because I've never heard King George described as a globalist, but that has really strong meaning today, but it was very valid. And then when I think about my pastor, very much a bigger historian, obviously most good pastors are, and he actually went to law school, and he told me probably, I think it was 2006, and he said, read the Declaration of Independence as an indictment, like you would read a court indictment. He said, because that's exactly what it is. And when you read it in that manner, it totally changes your outlook on that amazing document.
Yeah. So the kings had what's called the divine right of kings, and they claim that the creator gives all the rights and power to the king, and he dispenses it to all these lowly subjects down below. And with the Reformation came this idea that the creator gives the rights directly to each person. And we are all equal, and we choose from amongst equals who's going to do different responsibilities. And so when the Declaration says all men are endowed by their creator, we basically leave out the king. So instead of creator king people, it's creator people. And so the King of England did not think everyone was created equal. He thought he was created a little extra special. Right. He's the divine right of kings, chosen. King James of England said, kings are God's lieutenants upon earth, sit upon God's throne. The king is the overlord of the whole land, master over every person, having power over the life and death of everyone. And so, yes, so it's an indictment that the king has had his army, his navy plunder our coasts and plunder our cities, and he's incited the natives on the frontiers to butcher the inhabitants. He's appointed all the judges. He's taxed us without representation. And it is interesting that Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration has the coup d'etat indictment that the king has enslaved people in Africa who has never offended him, and forced them to be transported hither, and many of them dying in the transportation. And he stopped every effort of the colonies to end this execrable commerce in humankind. And it almost passed, except for South Carolina and Georgia.
Right.
And the delegate says, well, we got to check on this one and go back to our states. And the city of New York had just been invaded by the British. Buildings were being burned. Philadelphia was in a panic. And they're like, we don't have time for you to travel all the way back to Georgia and have another meeting and come back. And they had previously agreed that the Declaration should be unanimous. And they couldn't be unanimous without South Carolina and Georgia. So they said, look, let's just take that slavery item out of the Declaration. We'll worry about that later. Right. They did put in to the Constitution that the importation of slaves should end in 1807, which it did, and Jefferson was the president that signed that legislation. But they did not free all the slaves that had already come over, right until the Civil War and the 13th Amendment. But it is interesting that Jefferson had put that into the original draft of the Declaration.
Right.
As it relates to the signers, if I remember my history, was it about 56 people who signed the Declaration of Independence? Was that the approximate number?
I think you're correct.
Yes.
One of them, I grew up in the state of New Jersey, which is often a very maligned and misunderstood state, very schizophrenic. Cities are horrible and its towns are wonderful. But in terms of the American Revolutionary War, you think of the Battle of Trenton and Monmouth and Morristown and Princeton, so on and so forth. it had a major role. And where I grew up, just down the road, there was a place called Batstow Village, which is still there. It's a historic site. And they made a lot of the things that Washington's army needed. And there was a gentleman who signed the Declaration of Independence, who you very rarely hear of, but I think he was a very interesting person because he was one of the folks from the state of New Jersey, now has a university named after him, Richard Stockton. And I think Richard Stockton was a very interesting person as it relates to his part, Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, he was, and he went through a lot of persecution. And a matter of fact,
he was jailed at one time.
Yeah, he had a neighbor who was a loyalist who snitched on him. So the Declaration was approved January 2nd, and that's the date that John Adams thought would be celebrated.
July 2nd.
Excuse me, July 2nd. Thank you. And then July 4th is when it was signed by John Hancock, who put his big John Hancock on there, and the secretary, who was Charles Thompson. They then had an engrossed copy that was done by August 2nd, I think, and they began to sign that. But by that time, a bunch of people had gone back to their states to fight a war, and it didn't completely get signed until about 6 months later. And the thought is some of them may not have been in a big hurry to sign it, because this would be like you coming out against a corrupt president and verbally talking about the deep state and all the corrupt stuff going on.
Oh my God, this is like today.
And they would want to cancel you and shut you up and come after you and have the IRS come after you and have the Department of Justice come after you. And so they knew as soon as they finished signing it, it would get printed and published and be read by the King of England, and every one of those names they were going to come after. And that's what happened to Richard Stockton. He was 46 years old when he signed the Declaration. He had a neighbor that snitched to the British. The British were offering money and rewards if they could find spies and people that would snitch. And so they dragged Richard Stockton from his bed at night and jailed him. And he was in jail for a long time during the war, suffered for it. He did have a son that I think it was Robert Stockton, but he was in the Navy, and he's the one that captured California from New Spain or Mexico. And so that's where Stockton, California came from. But Richard Stockton was a very important person during the time of the Revolution.
And if I remember correctly, some of that jail time, I think, occurred in England, not just the United States. I think wasn't he in jail in England for a while? I could be wrong about that.
I don't know the answer to that offhand.
Yeah.
Okay,
but
not sure either. It was a long time ago, but I just find American history and our founding fathers, so funny. And I think people overlook this, and bear with me.
Yeah,
our nation is an invention. It literally, nothing existed like America before America. And you obviously suggest that wherever you look in the world, whether it was a tribal chieftain, an emperor, a king, or a queen, the average person had somebody's equivalent of a jackboot on their throat. And if you were born on the bottom rung of society, you stayed on the bottom rung of society. The American experiment, as you related to the Hebrews, as you related to the Greeks, so on and so forth, we are an experiment that still works. And I find offense to all these people who are so willing to throw it away. There are two people I know very well, one from Slovenia, one from Albania, who got out of communist countries. They are shocked that young Americans want to live in the equivalent of what Albania and Slovenia were prior to their freedom.
Yeah. A little history on Richard Stockton. He was a brother-in-law of Elias Boudinot. And Elias Boudinot was the president of the Continental Congress. He later even signed the Treaty of Paris. And Elias Boudinot helped found the American Bible Society. But Elias Boudinot's brother-in-law is Richard Stockton, who went on to become a judge. Stockton signed the Declaration. In 1767, Stockton had traveled to England, where he met with leaders, including the Marquis de Rockingham, the Earl of Chatham, and Edmund Burke.
Wow.
And Edmund Burke wrote later in his reflections on the French Revolution, people will not look forward to posterity who never look backward to their ancestors. So, but Richard Stockton had the honor of meeting King George III on behalf of the trustees of Princeton College. And Richard Stockton gave an address acknowledging the repeal of the Stamp Act and to England. In other words, saying how, you know, the Stamp Act can't be enforced. It's irrational. And so the Stamp Act was passed by the British Parliament 2 years earlier in 1765. It required a tax on every piece of paper, legal documents, licenses, newspapers, publications, and every letter that you sent back and forth. Richard Stockton traveled to Scotland, where he met a young Princeton graduate who was attending medical school in Scotland named Benjamin Rush. And Benjamin Rush later signed the Declaration of Independence.
Wow.
God bless America.
And man, Greg, you unleashed a nugget to us here.
As I said, the folks from New Jersey very often don't get their propers because it's not just refineries and it's not just the Supreme.
I mean, who knew of that connection to Benjamin Rush? Who, I mean, obviously, those who know American history really do honor Benjamin Rush, but to know that Richard Stockton played a big role in that man's life, that's fascinating.
Well, as a matter of fact, Benjamin Rush married Richard Stockton's daughter, Julia.
Oh my gosh.
So they were in-laws.
It's crazy.
And then Stockton...
You've just made my 3 grandkids very happy because they live in that part of the world.
So Richard Stockton and Benjamin Rush then persuaded a Scottish minister to leave Scotland, come to America, and become the president of Princeton College. His name was Reverend John Witherspoon.
Oh my! I knew you were going to say that. I'm overwhelmed now. This is just
totally John
God, this is totally God providence there. How he combined all these people.
And John Witherspoon signed the Declaration of Independence.
Right.
And then when the British invaded New Jersey, Richard Stockton and his family had to flee for their lives.
Right.
He was betrayed by loyalists, dragged from his bed at night, imprisoned in New York. His farm was pillaged. His library, which was considered one of the best in the country, was completely burned. His health was broken for over a year in the British prison. He died bankrupt at the age of 51 on February 28th, 1781. So he didn't even live to see the end of the war.
Talk about courage and having real meaning and purpose.
And New Jersey placed a statue of Richard Stockton in the U.S. Capitol's Statuary Hall. Here's what he wrote in his will. He said, as my children may be peculiarly impressed with the last words of their father, I think proper here not only to subscribe to the entire belief of the great leading doctrine of the Christian religion, but also the heart of a father's affection to exhort them to remember that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
Wow.
Now, and as I mentioned, one of his sons was Richard Stockton, who was a U.S. Senator from New Jersey. And then another grandson was Robert Stockton, who was a Navy Commodore and hero of the War of 1812. He helped freed slaves to found Liberia, West Africa. And in 1846, Commodore Robert Stockton, the grandson of Richard, the signer of the Declaration, defeated the Mexican army, captured California for the United States, and served as its military governor. And so both Stockton, New Jersey, and Stockton, California were named for him.
My youngest memory, GK, of growing up in Northern California, my first memory of a house, my mother could not believe it because she said, you couldn't have remembered that. You were too young. Was living in Stockton, California.
Wow.
American history is absolutely fascinating. And when I think of all the people, especially in the media right now, who are either tone deaf, retarded, or flat out evil, because we're destroying something that, though imperfect, is a darn sight better than the competition. America is still a very wonderful place. No one is risking their life escaping from South Korea into North Korea. You know?
Yeah, and America is the last best hope of the earth. If it falls, what are you going to have? Russia, China, Islamic jihadists, Iran. America has been holding back the floodgates of totalitarianism. And I always like to point out that the abolitionist movement was started in America.
And the Republican Party was part of that too.
Yes. But the origins, so abolition did not start with Muhammad. Muhammad was a white Arab who owned African slaves. And in Arabic, there is one word for African and slave, the same word, it's abid. So every black person they would call slave. And Islam enslaved 180 million Africans, castrate the men, make them eunuchs in the harem, make them galley slaves, sell the women into harems. India has a whole class of slaves. They're called the Dalits, the untouchables. They got to clean the sewers and take out the garbage. And no matter how good they do, they're condemned as a class to do that. And then India also has generational indebtedness. So your ancestor was in debt and worked on a farm, and the debt is passed on to the kids and grandkids and great-grandkids. And with inflation, they never, ever get free from it. And so it's basically slavery. China has had 5,000 years of emperors, and now they just switch it out for a communist dictator. But they're used to this class Confucius society that whatever your dad and granddad did, you and your kids are going to do, and you don't rock the boat by changing your level of hierarchy in society. And there is no effort of emperors to want to raise up the slaves to be equal to the emperor.
Well, let me just interrupt you there, if you don't mind, because you were talking about India. Years ago, when I was doing a radio show on a regular basis, I interviewed Dinesh D'Souza. And I asked Dinesh, what's the basic difference between America and India? His obvious background. And he said, here's the basic difference. I'm paraphrasing, but it's a very close to a quote. That in India, if you were even able to raise enough money to get a little fruit stand and you failed, you'd never get the money again. He said in America, you can fail and fail and fail and eventually win. And he said, one of the big differences, you get often a second, third, or fourth chance in America, and you don't get that in India.
Yeah, he brought that up in one of his movies he did in the last few years.
Yeah, a very bright man.
Yeah. And so the abolitionist movement started in America with Quakers. So 2 years after William Penn founds Pennsylvania, the Quakers in Germantown have the Germantown Petition in 1688, first document ever to call for the abolition of slavery. And then a couple years later, you have a Quaker named Anthony Benezet. He starts a school for black children. And then he writes a book on the horrors of the slave trade. And it's read by the founding fathers, and it makes an impact. Patrick Henry said, I've read Benezet's book and I can no longer defend slavery. So Patrick Henry pushed through a bill to end the importation of slaves into Virginia, and it passed. And so this was a movement that was growing, very similar to the pro-life movement today. Statistically, more people are becoming pro-life as the years go on.
Yeah.
With the advances in science, they realize that the baby in the womb is not a part of the mother's body. It is a brand new body of a brand new person inside of the mother's body. I know this is complicated for some people to understand, but it's sort of the way all of us have come into existence, right? And every mammal and almost every animal has come into existence this way, right? And so the idea is that America is this unique place where people get upward mobility. And so it was the anti-slavery movement started in America, and then John Wesley with the Methodists condemned slavery, and so they began to preach against it. You had Moravian missionaries and others preaching against it, but really it was the Second Great Awakening in the early 1800s that fueled the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad. With Charles Finney, a preacher, having Oberlin College being a stop on the Underground Railroad. And then you had Milwaukee, Wisconsin. A slave had been captured that had run away named Joshua Glover. And the Democrat Millard Fillmore had pushed through the fugitive slave law. So if they got free, you had to catch them and put them back. And so 5,000 white people stormed the jail to free Joshua Glover, a black man. And 2 days later, in 1854, March, these white people go to Ripon, Wisconsin, and form the Republican Party to get rid of the two planks of barbarism, slavery and polygamy. Polygamy was what was going on in Utah, and slavery. And so the Democrats in the Deep South had slavery, they had Jim Crow laws, they had black codes, they started the KKK, and Republicans pushed through the 13th Amendment ending slavery, 14th Amendment giving rights to freed slaves, 15th Amendment making sure the freed slaves could vote. You look at the votes that were taking place in Congress, it was all pushed through by Republicans.
Right.
And so it's not a black-white issue, it's a Democrat-Republican issue. Right? It's not a hardware problem, it's a software problem.
Well, Bill, today's American Minute, that everybody should sign up for your email you send out every day. I read something very interesting. You were talking about Cuba's.
At AmericanMinute.com.
Yeah, AmericanMinute.com. Sign up for his newsletter. But he talked about Cuba, but you brought something in there that I had forgotten about. Prior and during the Spanish-American War, during the 19th century, going into the 20th century, the military was not segregated. It was Woodrow Wilson who segregated the military. Now, of course, Harry Truman did desegregate it, but I don't think Harry Truman, along with John F. Kennedy, would be welcomed into the Democrat Party of today. But that was an interesting point, and I had forgotten about that the military was not segregated until Woodrow Wilson, who's many a hero of the left, was the one who segregated it.
Yeah. And Teddy Roosevelt, Republican, had the first black man in the White House for dinner, Booker T. Washington.
Right.
Woodrow Wilson had a viewing of a KKK film in the White House.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had Republican Eisenhower integrate the military.
Right.
And Democrat George Wallace down in the South saying, we're not going to integrate the schools. And Republican Eisenhower sending the federal troops to the South to escort the black students to class, right? And so we begin to see that this is a Democrat-Republican issue. Lyndon Johnson switched from intimidation to entitlement. So as a Democrat, instead of hosing them down on the streets, it was get them to sign up for welfare. And this Great Society welfare state, the idea is the more families that can get ruined and the people sign up for government welfare, you have a tendency to vote for those that are giving you money. And it was a way to build a Democrat voter base.
My goodness, that is a connection that I've never heard a historian make before. That to go from intimidation to, what'd you call it again?
Entitlement.
Yeah, that's an astounding connection.
Well, especially when you realize that when you hear from people or read about Lyndon Johnson, people who knew him and worked with him, he used the N-word a lot in his private conversations.
Oh, yeah.
He was no charming individual.
Yeah, he would pronounce it Nigra.
Yeah.
And Lyndon Johnson had a vile mouth. And there's very crude remarks that he made. Ron Kessler wrote a book, Inside the White House, and he had been on staff in the White House and observed all kinds of different presidents up close. And he talked about how the Republicans were pushing through a civil rights bill because the Republicans were the ones that pushed through all the civil rights bills.
Mm-hmm.
And LBJ said to the Democrat governors, if we pass a watered down version of this, then and do the entitlement programs, we will have those, and he used the N-word, voting Democrat for the next 200 years.
Please be sure to check out part 2 of Bill Federer's interview.